Guilty Gear Strive, also known as Guilty Gear 2020, has been a game of certain contention lately. This, of course, being due to the game being more simplified as its creator wants, which, if you've heard how the community responded, is clearly something that they do not want. I'm here to give my opinion on the matter, because a lot of people have been asking me how I feel. If you follow me on Twitter, you've heard me mention this in passing, but I don't want to hear any complaints that Strive is too simple, at least not as long as people are willing to praise Dragon Ball FighterZ in the very next breath. The reasoning for this is that it shows the hypocrisy of not only the FGC, but hypocrisy of gamers in general. Strive has not shown any sign of being dumbed down to the point where it cannot be recognized from its previous iterations. At worst, one could say the game is being simplified, just being below the BlazBlue series, which in and of itself is a pretty complex game as well. They got a spin-off title in the form of BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle, but don't worry, we'll get to that later. The reason I bring up Dragon Ball FighterZ is because it's by far the simplest and easiest present day fighter on the market at the current time. And of course, it is beloved because of the series on the cover. Now I know it's starting to sound like I have an axe to grind against the game, but this is far from the truth. The problem I have is that the game highlights what people are willing to accept and what they're not, depending upon what's on the cover. If it's an infamous series beloved worldwide, it can be subpar in mechanics and complexity and even controls, and we will praise it for being a modern take on the series that really gives the real feel of what the series stands for, all the while making it accessible for longtime fans who weren't fighting game players to begin with. Compared, of course, to a niche title that has always been one of the more, if not the most difficult 2D fighting games to ever be good, let alone great at. No, instead we will scorn and shame it before it even releases. In case it wasn't clear, the last bit was extremely sarcastic, since a lot of the most beloved Dragon Ball games were complex, such as the Budokai and the Budokai Tenkaichi series, so making the claim that simplicity is needed to bring in people for a beloved franchise is an outright lie. Compare this to a niche title that is trying to reach a wider audience, this would make much more sense. The difference, however, is when you compare the two side by side, you can tell one is nothing more than a pretty face with nothing to offer, and the other is still currently under development. Dragon Ball FighterZ released to critical acclaim while lacking in gameplay depth, a lack of mechanics, and lack of unique characters. Which begs the question, what exactly is everyone upset about when it comes to Guilty Gear Strive? And I think the answer is what's old being made new. You see, the current generation of gamers all played games when they were becoming more complex at the very beginning of video games' lifespans. Back when we thought going from Pong to 8-bit video games was seen as a giant technological leap. I mean, if one were to sit down and look at early platformers such as Sonic and Super Mario, it's very easy to see that those games compared to where they are now are very different things. This was because of two things: technological advancements and making marketing decisions to gain a new audience. Because, for example, while someone may not have been very receptive of 2D platforming, they may have been much more receptive to the 3D platforming. As such, the game switching from 2D to 3D would have gained a new audience. Combined, of course, with the following they had already had when leaving 2D to begin with. What I'm getting at here is when trying to attract a new audience, big changes and innovations are needed. Keeping things small and the same to keep the same audience is more often than not how things, not just video games, stagnate and become stale. Bringing this all back to Strive though, I think the changes they're making are good to get a new audience. When looking at how art got on many people's radars after the release of Dragon Ball FighterZ, it's very understanding that they would want to do what's necessary to get new people to play their other game. Because as I said before, their current audience is locked in and isn't going to stray too far if they really like one of their core franchises. Which brings me to BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle and its place in all of this. BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle is a simplified version of its core franchise, but in exchange for this, it brought a lot of the franchises under Arc's umbrella together, such as Under Night, Arcana Heart, and of course Persona. And as of the recording of this video, it still has 2 unnamed franchises to be released for the game. The game also added franchises that have nothing to do with Arc, such as Ruby, Senran Kagura, and of course even the old Akatsuki Blitzcamp game. As such, it gives these characters a way to be playable in an up-to-date fighter or in a fighting game for the first time. The reason I bring up cross tag at the center of the simplification controversy is because it directly implies that people are only willing to accept simplification when it suits them. You see, many people the world over praise Dragon Ball FighterZ for its lackluster gameplay and game mechanics, but these same people complained that cross tag wasn't as complex as its core series. Yes, BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle, by its own creator's words, Tatsumichi Mori, is a spin-off title. The complaints about the lack of depth compared to its core series just serve to show the innate bias that people have. By bias, I'm referring to the mentality that if anyone wants to play a game, they should just get good. By getting good, they mean get good with all the mechanics that are in the core games. The problem with this is the same thought process can be carried across the board. For example, Cross Tag has defensive mechanics in its push blocking and burst mechanics, mild character depth compared to their core franchises, and characters play different from one another. Compare this to Dragon Ball FighterZ, where only very few characters played differently when the game first released. The game being far too rewarding to the player who's on offense, no defensive mechanics outside of the reflect, which is a far cry away from a real defensive mechanic, and the emergency change is serviceable at best. Both games have a comeback mechanic, but the differences between the two are very glaring. For Cross-Tag Battle's comeback mechanic, it gets better the more you call your assist and your characters work together as a team, making it so that you actually have a fighting chance when you have the strongest version. This compared to Dragon Ball FighterZ, because of how linear the gameplay is, the mechanic is often more used to touch or death a character or save a character on the brink of death. I am aware there are more key differences between the two titles, but I just wanted to highlight the biggest ones. What I'm getting at with the comparison here is that people are willing to accept the game for not being complex. All that matters is what's on the box will determine whether or not people will complain or not. As I've said many times, I personally am not a fan of the Dragon Ball franchise, but I can respect that the game looks pretty, but that's where the praise ends. All this talk about not liking games for becoming more simplified while praising a game that is as simple as it gets is not a conversation that I like to have, nor do I want to have. I myself am personally reserving judgment on Strive until I actually play it. Even if the game is simplified, how simplified it is will always be the question. There is nothing wrong with removing a few features so the game isn't as polarizing to those new to the series, and of course if the new players want to see what the game is like with all of its features, they can always pick up Exard or Revelator as it's also known. Because similar to Central Fiction, there will always be people playing the older title even when the new one releases. That's my opinion on the whole Strive debacle, which is not an issue to me. I'm curious to know how you guys feel about Strive. I will begin to cover it on this channel, so definitely like and subscribe. This way I know me covering Guilty Gear is definitely something you guys want to see.